Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Fall Human Rights Keynote Lecture. I'm Ilora Chaudhry, faculty in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and director of the interdisciplinary minor in human rights. Each year, we gather in the fall with our students and members of the community with a topic of importance to our curriculum. We focus on topics that are timely, historically influential, politically urgent, and globally relevant. December 10th, as you know, is the World Human Rights Day. It commemorates the day the General Assembly of the UN adopted and enunciated across the world the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. We are also just at the tail end of the annual UN Women's 16 Days of Activism on Gender-Based Violence, activities from 25th November to 10th December taking place under the 2020 global theme of Orange the World, Fund, Respond, Prevent, Collect, highlighting a shared responsibility and global solidarity, particularly to our responses to the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19. Moreover, this year we are also commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Fourth World Conference on Women held in Beijing, China in 1995, a movement that galvanized feminist advocacy, particularly around violence, and led to the creation of the Office of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences, and an explicit recognition at the UN level to violence against women as a human rights concern. So what an honor that we have with us today, Professor Rashida Manjoo from the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women at the UN. An anti-apartheid activist, women's liberation campaigner, a lawyer, a researcher. She's described in an interview in 2015 as someone who always acts on the belief to bring town and gown together, to bridge the local and the global, to remain engaged in both theory and practice. And it is this historical, intersectional, and broad-based vision that we strive for in the work that we do in the minor. And we are so proud today to have with us Tashi Lhamu, who graduated in 2020 and is going to share with us with her own transnational praxis of human rights. Before I turn to my colleague, Nada Ali, to introduce our distinguished speakers, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank our generous co-sponsors, the Consortium for Gender, Security, and Human Rights, the Center for Women, Politics, and Public Policy, the PhD in Conflict Resolution, Global Governance, and Human Security, the Honors College, Department of Political Science, and of course, the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. A warm thanks to our department chair, Professor Amani El Jack, for her support, and to our department manager, Brittany Downey, for all the work, indeed all the invisible work of organizing, outreach, publicity, and hosting the webinar today. Just a note on the logistics. We are so delighted to invite our audience, particularly the students from the Introduction to Human Rights, our gateway course taught by Professor Nada Ali. And all members of the audience are invited to post questions, which we will take up after Tashi and Rashida have shared their comments. And please feel free to pose your questions as we go along. So with that, I'll turn to Professor Ali.
Thank you very much, Professor Chowdhury. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce both Tashi Lhamu and Professor Rashida Manjoo. We will start with Tashi Lhamu. She will speak first. Professor Manjoo suggested that the young activist and scholar speaks first. Tashi Lhamu graduated earlier this year from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she majored in social psychology and human rights, and she is currently an MA student at Boston University School of Social Work. Born to Tibetan refugees from India, Tashi is intimate with the immediate experience of refugees. Throughout her childhood, she was the sole form of daily aid for her single mother, who did not speak fluent English. After losing their home in Wisconsin because of the 2008 financial crisis, her family moved to Queens, New York, for more income opportunities and to be closer to their Tibetan community and friends. Tashi is obviously passionate about the cause of Tibetan people and especially the rights of women of Tibet. She has taken several classes with me during her tenure here at UMass Boston. And I would like to say that she is one of the very best students I taught here at UMass Boston. She is the recipient of the Human Rights Book Award of 2020. Over to you, Tashi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Oops. Okay, yep, here we go. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so thank you for that great introduction and for inviting me to speak at this event. Very honored to be speaking for your class as well as the Friends of the Human Rights minor. It gives me great joy to be honored and feel that you are proud of me. You always reiterate that to me all of the time. So thank you for that. It's also a great way for me to practice my public speaking. I was working on that a lot with Nada during my senior year there, and she gave me a lot of great books and recommendations and confidence. So thank you for that too. I'm also not as tech savvy as I thought I was. So I didn't realize if I was sharing my screen that I wouldn't be able to look at my document. So I'm going to be looking sort of this way at my notes. So I also want to say thank you to all the students here. I know that everybody has their finals and maybe you have a class next that you have to go through or go to. So thank you for taking the time to be here and hear me and Rashida talk. In my time at UMass Boston, I attended so many human rights and women and gender studies events. And, there were so many great, interesting and achieved speakers, and you walk around campus and you see all these flyers of really great topics and great descriptions for the events. And I think that was somewhat what intimidated me about speaking right now or speaking to you all at this event, because I'd been to so many before. And that was why I was initially intimidated. But nonetheless, such events did encourage me to be a part of the human rights minor eventually. I think during my first year here, I didn't decide on a minor at that point, but those events really encouraged me to really adopt this human rights minor. I wanted to learn about global and domestic issues concerning individuals and communities, and I really do feel that it prepared me for graduate school. I'm thinking about critical thinking, and I'm sure she's not as drilled this into you all, the concept of intersectionality, and I do think that is a very important concept to understand for your future. So I also wanted to say that I hope, similar to the way that these events and the class impacted me, I hope at least maybe one of you are motivated to be a part of the great human rights minor. Even if you have any extra electives, I think the human rights classes themselves are really great to fill in for those. But I think the minor itself is a great supplement to any major that you choose, because what you learn from the human rights minor in the classes, you can bring to the table in many of your other classes, whether it's just a topic and bringing a wider lens to any topic you're talking about, or just bringing your critical thinking skills. I also think at the end of the human rights minor, there's an internship component, and I had my internship with Muna Killingback in Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy. It's a really long title, but I absolutely loved it. It was in the last semester of college for me, so spring 2020, And that was when, the coronavirus hit. So half of my internship was done fully remotely, but it still worked out. I really liked working with Muna. She had such a wealth of knowledge, and she really cares about human rights a lot, representing a lot of the different faculty here who care as much as she does too. So yeah, I next wanted to talk about UMass Boston and the human rights minor. So yeah, those events influenced me to join the minor, and when I began taking the classes, it was really clear how passionate everyone was and is about human rights and passing on its history to students. I wanted to learn from people like Nada that I saw in all of those events that I'd gone to about global human rights issues, and specifically how other liberation movements have strategized and organized their communities in their struggles, because I wanted to eventually take part in the liberation movement for Tibet in some capacity, maybe not directly, but in some organizational format too. So as Nada said, by the time I graduated, I had taken 3 classes with her, and she, I think, is a really great resource for everybody to use, whether she's your professor or not. And I think that's what really helped me in my college time, was to really use all the resources that are available to you, even those that you think aren't really traditionally there for you. So why human rights? I wanted to talk about that a little bit, why I chose it. As Nada said, I have a personal history of, I don't like to say oppression. I guess just struggling a lot with my family. That definitely impacted me a lot. And my mom was a single mother. She came to America from India in the late 90s with her family, but she was in an arranged marriage, so they separated. She had to raise me and my brother on her own, which was pretty hard because she was a refugee in India, and so she didn't have that much education and had to work. So seeing that struggle, and being her little social worker, as some scholars like to say, advocating for her and translating for her in different institutional spaces, made me interested in working with immigrant and refugee populations, specifically in the realm of human and social services, which is what I'm studying now at Boston University. Oh, I just realized I never said that. Sorry, I thought that would be in the introduction, but I am going to Boston University right now, School of Social Work, studying to work with refugee and immigrant populations. So yeah, outside of my personal interest and personal history with my family, it's not working. I wanted to give you all a brief history of Tibet on Human Rights Day. I would be very remiss if I didn't talk about my country and everything that's going on. And as you can see, Tibet is this significant portion of China right below Xinjiang, which I'm sure many of you know what's going on with the Uyghur people. And that has been happening also to Tibetan people historically. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And the history and ongoing struggle of Tibet made me passionate about human rights since I was a little child. Knowing about all of this traumatic history is very heavy for children. And I think it was still beneficial for me because it made me passionate throughout my whole life and sort of made my goals somewhat clear as I got into adulthood about what I wanted to do, college and higher education wise. So a little personal, I guess, connection to this. I didn't want to just talk about the history of Tibet and not give you any personal, I guess, connection to it. My grandmother actually, she was in her 30s. She was a young adult and she was a mother at the time when the events I'm going to tell you about from history happened. So she had to leave from Tibet all the way to India. She walked by foot in her migration. She was pregnant and had 4 children, but she had to leave because of how afraid she was of the Chinese Communist Party and their invasion. And she, along with other Tibetans and the Dalai Lama, went to India and lived in refugee villages. Here is a little brief history. There's a lot of details that I urge you, to look at if you want to. But so it all started in the 1950s. The Chinese occupation started. There was a really strong military force that came in And there was an agreement, the 8,000 point agreement that was signed by the Dalai Lama, but he was very young at the time. And when you have a military force coming in telling you to sign something, it's not really signed with full consent, and it was signed under duress. And actually the international community at the time didn't recognize it and saw it as illegal. But nonetheless, the agreement included items for the Chinese government to protect and preserve the Tibetan religion and culture that is so essential to our identity, our collective identity. But throughout that decade, they violated it continuously. And that all came to a head at the end of the decade in 1959, when there was a Tibetan uprising, which mostly was in Lhasa, which is the city, the center of Tibet, somewhat right there. But yeah, there's estimated that there's like close to like 900,000 people who died during that initial uprising by the brutal retaliation by the Chinese Communist Party. And many people migrated out, including the Dalai Lama. And after he had left, he was not only the spiritual leader of the land, but he was also the political figure. So when he left during the latter half of the 20th century, that's when China was really able to strengthen its force in Tibet. And there was an ongoing cultural and religious genocide of our people. And the Tibetan government in exile estimates that during the 20-year period after 1959, 1.2 million people, 1.2 million Tibetans, which is about a fifth of the population, were killed. And many others were imprisoned and exiled to labor camps as well. And representing the fact that they want to sort of systematically kill off our religion, the monasteries, temples, and other cultural and historic buildings are destroyed. About 6,000 of them are estimated, and it still happens to this day, but there aren't really any exact figures about that, but it's still going.
1 minute left, Tashi.
Oh, really? Oh, sorry. Okay. I spent too much time talking earlier. So there's wrongful imprisonment that continues to happen. You can really get imprisoned for anything that's separatist, which is basically practicing your religion, praying, or even listening to Tibetan music. And when people are imprisoned, there's violent electric shocks, attacks from dogs, and sexual abuse that are reported as well. There was an article that I put here from the New York Times of a Tibetan political prisoner in 2018. He got arrested just for talking to the New York Times about the importance of preserving the language for children in Tibet, because the Chinese government doesn't teach Tibetan to the children there. They teach Mandarin only. So I'll go on. So as I said, there's a lot of different human rights abuses, but I didn't want to go through all of them, but I'll list them here for you all to look at. There's a forced sterilization of women that's still going on. A lot of nuns are also political prisoners. There's also the transfer of many Han majority people, which is the majority of people in China, who are being suggested to move into Tibet to be the cultural majority in our own country. And they also are advantaged more for different jobs too. I also wanted to talk a little bit more about this quote, but that's fine. I wanted to give you all this quote as you go forward. And I'm sure many of you are advocates and many of you are really interested in social justice. So I wanted to let you guys know about this quote from Audre Lorde: "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare," which I wanted to put that in there for you, but I also feel like it connects to the Tibetan resistance movement as well, as practicing our religion and talking about these issues is something that the Chinese government really doesn't want us to do, doesn't want the people in Tibet to do, and they kill and imprison people for doing that. So we outside in the diaspora can continue to do so. Okay, thank you. Sorry for that disorganization.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tashi. Thank you very much, Tashi. I really appreciate your talk, and I think what you just said is really inspiring for many of us, including for students enrolled in Intro to Human Rights. I just want to add, I want to thank you for your kind words, but I want to add that, there are so many faculty members at UMass Boston, and especially in the human rights minor, who are really wonderful. And I want to really, shout out to them really during Human Rights Day, and to thank them for everything that they do. So thank you very much. And now I want to introduce Professor Manjoo. This is really an honor and a great pleasure to welcome her and also to introduce her. Professor Rashida Manjoo is professor in the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She is, of course, our 2020 Human Rights Keynote speaker. Professor Manjoo, I want to say also that I'm going to try and be very brief because we could spend the whole day, outlining the accomplishments of Professor Manjoo. She was visiting professor at various universities in and outside the United States, including Webster University, Harvard University, and Boston University. Among her many publications on various themes, including gender-based violence against women, social justice issues, women and the law in South Africa, is her book, Women's Charters and Declarations, Building Another World. Professor Manjoo grew up in Durban, South Africa, and has learned about the gender-specific impact of violence, inequality, and injustice at an early age under apartheid South Africa. She has been a strong advocate on social justice, gender equality, and the human rights of diverse women in South Africa, across the African region, and also globally for over 3 decades. Professor Manjoo, as Professor Chaudhary has told us, was an active campaigner against apartheid in South Africa. And after the fall of apartheid, she served as parliamentary commissioner of the Commission on Gender Equality. This is an institution which the Constitution of South Africa created to oversee the promotion of gender equality. Professor Manjoo has also been part of several campaigns at the regional level, including the campaign that led to the adoption of the African Union's Protocol on the Rights of Women in Africa, otherwise known as the Maputo Protocol. She is the founder of the Gender Unit at the Law Clinic at the University of Natal and the Domestic Violence Assistance Program at the Durban Magistrates Court, which is the first such project in a court in South Africa. Between 2009 and 2015, Professor Manjoo served as the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences. And during this time, she carried out numerous missions in different countries, both in the global north and the global south, where she investigated the multiple and intersecting forms of violence and discrimination against women, and where she pressed for more accountability on the part of national governments as well as globally. Professor Manjoo has received numerous honors, including honorary degrees from the City University of New York, Glasgow University, and Northeastern University. She is the recipient of awards from the American Bar Association and Albany Law School, as well as the UNESCO. Above all, Professor Manjoo is such a wonderful human being who is committed to empowering women and young people and who always practices what she preaches. Over to you, Professor Manjoo. Would you like me to share your PowerPoint?
Yeah, share screen. Okay, there we go. Okay, am I unmuted? I think so.
Yes, you are.
Thanks so much for those kind words, Nada, and thank you very much to the organizers for putting this together, for the students for participating, and for all our other participants out there. Some familiar names on the screen as well. Tashi, thank you so much for setting the scene. I think you are amazing in terms of your educational attainments, doing human rights courses. But there is a slogan in the 80s that feminist women's movements had: the personal is political. And the fact that you highlight that for us about how your personal narratives, the anecdotal stuff, that is so important in terms of the political, in terms of pushing for standard setting, for normativity, for visibility, etc. So thank you for sharing that. And I think you are an amazing human rights activist. I'm going to take issue with the fact that you said you don't want to use the word oppression. You can use the word oppression, because oppression functions at the individual, the institutional, the structural, the societal level, and your history, your US experiences bring that to the fore. So I don't think it's a word that's restricted to certain understandings of oppression, because it is much wider than that. So you have permission to use the word, which you don't need. But thank you again to all of you. I decided the last minute that I would do a PowerPoint, partly because we do have connectivity problems. While Nada was speaking, my internet went off for a few seconds. And I am concerned in case we get cut off, but at least we have some slides. The other reason for doing the slides is I turned 65 2 days ago, and the universities in South Africa, at 65, they kick us out. We deadwood, they don't want us anymore. So we have mandatory retirement. And at an event to celebrate my retirement, one of the things that a student that's not in the law faculty brought to my notice is that human rights academics and activists assume that we all know the histories, we know the developments, etc. And I thought for an audience that includes students, it will be important to kind of do a bit of looking back, but having it in front of you so that if I go a little bit fast, it's not hugely problematic. Okay, I'm gonna. This was something that a friend of mine shared from Facebook, and I think it was in relation to the US elections. And it resonates. And I don't know if you can see the writing. It's the little girl's asking, but what if they lose? And the adult answers, then we keep fighting for the rights of all people. And if they win, oh dear girl, it's the same answer. All right. So we keep on fighting. And that's what it feels like. I was reflecting. I mean, I have a working life of 47 years. And it feels like the more things change, the more they remain the same in some ways. But there have been achievements. And I think we do need to celebrate that. But we also need to acknowledge the struggles. I did not situate my presentation in COVID because I think that's the easy, lazy way to do it, because the problems that we highlight have existed pre-COVID. COVID has exacerbated, it's rendered invisible the huge disparities and inequalities in all our societies. And so I have been refusing these past few months to fixate on COVID as if COVID caused all the problems that we face globally. It's been there, it's structural, it's systemic. So there have been positive legal developments. And because this is International Human Rights Day, it's Beijing plus 25, it's 75 years of the UN being created, 20 years since the adoption by the Security Council of the Women, Peace and Security Resolution 1325. So, when we think about standard setting, legal developments that have emanated from the international system, there have been numerous positive developments, particularly on standard setting, which have led to legal developments at the regional and the national levels, although to differing degrees. We now have more than 150 countries that have equality and or non-discrimination on the basis of sex and or gender in their constitutions. Yes, many of them are the new constitutions, but I think that's a huge shift from not having equality and non-discrimination in your constitutions to now having it. Not that the US has it at the moment. There has been an acknowledgement that women's human rights are fundamentally a question of justice, and there's a need for transformative measures. And the word transformative occurs in almost every document that emanates out of the UN in the last 10 years or so. I have deliberately spelt women the way I conduct my life, which is an inclusive approach based on biology as well as self-identification, non-binary. I think inclusiveness is the way to go. We may have challenges and difficulties in terms of our acceptance levels and the debates around transgender persons, the debates around sex work as work. These are issues that if we exclude, we don't have the discussion, we don't open the door. And so in my teaching, in the work that I do, I adopt the inclusive approach because I believe that opens the door to discussions. I think it's important to look back at the history and the status of women, including formal developments, and acknowledge the changes on the ground. But we have to, and this is not about being negative, it's about being realistic. It's important to note the challenges and the barriers, and there have been many, and I'm sure many of you know. But the acknowledgement that this is a question Hey.
So we've lost you.
Yes, you did. My internet went off again. All right, so I'm going to share my screen again. That's not the screen you want to see. Okay. So, and I'm really sorry about this, but it's going to go in and out. I know that much. We don't have good connectivity. So the demands historically come from a context of the public-private divide. The status of women, their legal personhood depended on their relationships to men, to their fathers, their husbands, the brothers, the sons. And the strict separation of the legal, the political, the economic, and social domains. We come from male-dominated societies, which still exist in some countries. Patriarchy, the idea of being your brother's keeper and protecting other men and their power. In this 1486 book, women are described as a defect of creation, imperfect animals, the discriminatory customs, practices, law. And, you know, we can see it in terms of women's personal status, in terms of marital status, in terms of divorce, lack of citizenship rights, voting rights, participating in the political domain, inheritance right, bodily integrity. So not being able to control sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity issues. There is a myth that women's human rights demands emanated from the UN. We know that's not true. I think people who teach in the women's studies departments know that very well and teach that. We know that authors and activists and artists have been involved in pushing for equality. And in the early days, the demand was for formal equality, to be treated the same as men. And we are a long way away from that now. Okay. Okay, I think I've missed a slide. So early examples of women's activism. Think of Olympia de Gouges, 1791. She responds to the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and develops and writes a Declaration on the Rights of Women. Of course, she pushes for formal equality, to be treated the same as men, but recognizing women's oppression in the different spheres, women's invisibility, women's exclusion from the public sphere, whether it's about property rights or voting rights, etc. She was, of course, executed by the French government. The democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, right? So we believe in democracy, but we don't believe in full rights of citizenship for women. Prohibitions on voting, holding public office, owning property. The suffragist movement, women started campaigns and they were militant about it, holding protests, hunger strikes on issues of equality, bodily integrity, demands for contraceptives during this time. The abolition of slavery struggles, it resonates, the slavery struggles resonates for women in terms of oppression, exclusion, discrimination, and the debates and discussions on the emancipation of women also arises during this time. Self-determination struggles, the 1919 Paris Peace Conference and the demand for the inclusion of women. And ironically, the First World War opened up the opportunities because women were needed in the war efforts. After the Second World War, we see internationalization, the attempts to create a new world order based on guarantees, protection of inherent dignity and rights of every human being without distinction. The UN Charter, which is 75 years old now, created the UN, the prohibition, and there were 4 grounds of discrimination that were identified in the UN Charter on the basis of race, sex, language, religion, no gender, no color. The UDHR, which is the the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it's the first comprehensive agreement to capture what is the vision of human rights. The preamble states all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and then Article 1 on equality and non-discrimination. The UDHR, and I think it was last year, or the year before, I did an article looking at the UDHR and to see how gender responsive it was. And the UDHR has gender neutral language. And I recently found an article, and the delegate from Belgium and India, the 2 delegates who were sitting in these negotiations, were pushing for specificity in terms of using the language of women's rights, etc. But it was actually Eleanor Roosevelt who pushed for a more pragmatic approach, so keep it gender neutral. And her name comes up as being an architect of the UDHR, but we forget that there were the other women, the one from India, the one from Belgium, etc., that had, I think, when we look back now in 2020, a more progressive interpretation and the need for specificity. After 1948, of course, you have many covenants, treaties, but largely we don't see women at the table. We don't see them as part of the processes and framing and helping to shape that. As with all normative frameworks that are developed, there are institutions that are set up. And in 1946, the Commission on Human Rights was established with a subcommission on the status of women. And that says a lot, why not have 2 commissions, one as a generic human rights and one with a specificity considering the status of women in 1946, 1947. The Commission on the Status of Women is established as an autonomous body, but under the Economic and Social Council and not under the General Assembly. And that's a thesis topic on its own, to kind of think about institutions and how women are still left on a back burner. So the further developments that we see now from 1945 to 1962, it's about the legal foundations of equality, civil and political rights, equality before the law, etc. 1963 to 75, there's a recognition of women's role in development, and the importance of having women in public and, looking at the issue of development in public and private spaces. For our purposes, 1975 to 1985, the UN declared that the Decade of Women, International Women's Year, CEDAW adopted in 1979, and 4 world conferences held during this, 3 world conferences held during this decade: Mexico, Copenhagen, and Nairobi. And then we had Beijing in 1995. The thematic focus, equality, development, and peace. But there was also the recognition, and the Nairobi meeting in 1985 actually reinforced the issue of violence against women as a human rights violation, not as a private matter, etc. A World Conference on Human Rights held in Austria and Vienna. Again, a declaration and the principles of interdependence, indivisibility, universality of rights. There was widespread, and I use the word co-option of the slogan on women's rights, human rights, and it's attributed to Hillary Clinton. No, it was a Chilean jurist who actually came up with the slogan. And I think, these are things that, as feminists, as activists, as human rights scholars, we need to unpack how women in the global south are invisibilized, even when they've contributed in massive ways, and how it becomes so easy to attribute a slogan like this to Hillary Clinton because she said it in Beijing in 1995. But it was actually a jurist in Chile who first coined the phrase. And you can see I'm a very disruptive person, so I don't accept when someone says, someone in the global north said this. I want to actually find out. I also thought it important to highlight some specific legal developments of the past. So imagine in 1949, we have a Convention for the Suppression of Trafficking Persons, Exploitation or Prostitution of Others. Today, we talk about trafficking, we talk about contemporary forms of slavery, we talk about servitude. And yet in 1949, there was a convention adopted on this topic, but today we talk about it in isolation of that context. 1952 Convention on the Political Rights of Women, about women's right to vote, about women's right to participate in political forums, in highest decision-making bodies, etc. In 1952, we have a convention. Today, we still talk about it as if it's a new issue. 1957 Convention on the Nationality of Married Women. This is an important one because there are countries where women are deprived of their nationality if they marry someone of a different nationality. They lose their nationality of country of origin. Nationality also impacts married women who cannot pass on their nationality to their children if they're married to a foreign man. Or pass on nationality to their partners or their spouses. And so in 1957, we already was talking about nationality and the discrimination that we were seeing. 1962, there's a Convention on Consent to Marriage, minimum age of marriage, registration of marriage. Today, we talk about early enforced child marriages, as if we've never discussed this issue before. But in 1962, there was this convention adopted. In 1966, 2 major conventions, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. Unfortunately, politically, it wasn't palatable for member states of the UN to have one convention that would look at the indivisibility and interdependence of rights. So it was separated, and we ended up with a sort of first generation rights, civil and political rights, and second generation rights, economic, social, cultural rights, and then development rights later as third generation rights. And in 2020, we can see the mistake of having done that, because we know, there is no point in having the right to vote when you don't have sanitation and running water and shelter and housing, etc. In 1979, of course, is a landmark convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. CEDAW has 16 articles. Am I cut off again? No, I don't think so. 16 articles of substantive. There are many other articles. But what's missing in this is, and in my 6 years as the UN Special Rapporteur, I kept on highlighting the normative gap in international law, that CEDAW does not have a specific article on violence against women holistically. It has exploitation of women in Article 6 and the trafficking of women. Now, this is a 1979 document, but violence against women is prevalent from time immemorial, and yet in CEDAW we do not have that. What CEDAW has done to address the normative gap is to adopt general recommendations to address violence against women. General recommendations are not legally binding. So effectively, when we think about it, you have a legally binding treaty which creates obligations on states, but the states do not have an obligation to respond to, prevent, and eliminate violence against women. They don't have a legal obligation, right? They may have a political obligation, a social obligation, but under international law, there is no legal obligation to address violence against women because it's not in CEDAW and it's not in any other treaty. My inclination over the years has been to use the Torture Convention to address violence against women because many manifestations of violence amount to torture. So that's CEDAW. The policy developments in the UN, policy developments are not legally binding, even though states may sit and have discussions and reach consensus, but they're not legally binding because they don't create legal obligations on states to do anything. So there are many UN-sponsored conferences, and UN-sponsored conferences have created a space for meetings, and especially for the women's movements, for the transnational feminist movements. They facilitate dialogues, they build solidarity across continents and communities and different diversities. And usually you would get a declaration, an action program, a report, etc. So in Vienna, we had the World Conference, and the outcome documents include a declaration and a program of action. 1993, the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It's a declaration. It's not legally binding on states. It's a persuasive value. It's a political will if you want to adopt the standards. An important conference also was the 1994 Cairo Conference on Population Development, with a particular focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights. If you look at the documents on this conference, you can see how the language of rights got watered down because member states were more comfortable with using language of health. So we get health and rights. When I teach, I talk about sexual and reproductive rights as a starting point. And I think, health is subsumed under rights. Unfortunately, the language has been watered down and more palatable, so member states don't push back on this. Beijing, which we'll discuss, is a 95 conference, and again came up with outcome documents. We have Resolution 1325 from the Security Council on Women, Peace and Security, and then there have been 8 other Security Council resolutions. Why is the year 2000 and this resolution touted as crucial? It's the first time the Security Council ever addressed a women's rights issue, right? Never in the history of the Security Council had that happen. So it's a big deal. But the Security Council did not adopt 1325, this resolution, under Chapter 7 of the Security Council laws. Chapter 7 creates binding obligations. This is not, there are no legally binding obligations in terms of 1325. Again, that weakness. The Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted in 2000, have expired in 2015 and then were, I suppose, replaced with a much more expansive Sustainable Development Goals, which would expire in 2030. So these are the policy documents. Some of the policy documents, they don't create obligations. It's not like a treaty body that you report to them. There are concluding observations, etc. But they have persuasive value. They're political. Often it's political consensus is reached, but it doesn't translate into much at the local level. The Millennium Declaration was adopted in 2000, has been criticized, although it recognized that, we were in the year 2000 in the space in the world where we needed to work on three fronts: development, peace and security, and human rights, to address particularly the dehumanizing effects of poverty. And I think people who work in development know where we're coming from on this issue. So promoting gender equality and empowerment of women was seen as a way to combat poverty, hunger, and disease, to stimulate development that is sustainable. The focus was on education, health, economic opportunities, and decision-making through gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming comes out of Beijing as a tool, and of course, the securing of dignity, autonomy, and choice will underpin the goals. The barriers to women's advancement, which we know, which the MDGs identified, was maternal mortality under the health goal, which is pretty narrow. Barriers to female education, and the focus, unfortunately, became about primary school education. And when states reported on parity in education at that level, they were given a pat on the back, but questions were not being asked about why is there a high dropout rate of young women in high schools? What about tertiary education, etc.? And employment and political participation, and then issues related to land rights. Sustainable Development Goals, the report that emanated from this process is leave no one behind, place people at the center of the development agenda for the next 15 years, from 2015 to 2030, eradicate extreme poverty. And that sets a bit, the bar a bit high, extreme poverty, and that will then get examined through either World Bank or, that kind of lens, which is problematic. Protect the environment, and I think, the conferences, the Rio conference, etc., on the environmental protection is important. Promote social inclusion and economic opportunities. And the 5 Ps, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership, is the current discourse on development. And how to bring it together using the language of Vienna, the interdependency, interrelatedness, creating a just and prosperous world, etc. The SDGs are seen as the development pathway for the future for all of us, using the 5 Ps. 17 goals, 169 targets, and indicators have also been developed. So all the critiques of the MDGs, some of it gets addressed, including about indicators, data collection, accountability, and bringing together people, planet, and peace. SDG 5 is a dedicated goal on gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And then we see the same language of discrimination, violence, FGM, early and forced marriages, unpaid care work, because women doing the triple shift, women's full and effective participation. And we still see the same language that we see in CEDAW, etc. ICTs become a focus here. They enhance the use of technology. At the same time, be careful how technology is used against women, and strengthen legislation and policies at the national level to achieve these goals. So Beijing, I think half my stuff is cut off there, so I'm going to get my paper stuff. So the theme was Action for Equality, Development and Peace. Over 30,000 people, state and non-state actors, 189 countries represented. There was a review process of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies, a 1985 document, and trying to identify what are the gaps and the challenges. Another commitment made at this conference in 1995 for action aimed at transforming, so the transformative language starts coming up, reducing gender inequality in public and private spheres, No one objected to this because it was a watered down version with all the negotiations that go on until 4 or 5 in the morning in the UN. But it sets out principles and goals for improving equality and development. Again, it's that same language of equality, a woman's empowerment, removing barriers that prevent active participation. Interdependency, mutually reinforcing components of economic, social. So the Vienna language comes in here as well for sustainable development. These are the 12 critical areas of concern that were identified in Beijing as a way forward. Women in poverty, education, women in health, violence, armed conflict, economy, power and decision-making, institutional mechanisms for the advancement of women like gender commissions, women's commissions, etc. So national gender machinery. So, you know, taking the global back home to the local. Human rights of women, women in the media, women in the environment, and the girl child. So Beijing adopts a life cycle approach and includes the girl child, understanding that both in terms of a girl child being subjected to many of the same oppressions, subordination, discrimination as women, but also the girl child as being the future woman. So the life cycle approach was important. At the ripe old age of 65, I realized ageism is hugely at play in our societies. So older persons, older women didn't get included in Beijing. Beijing +5, so every 5 years there's a review process, but in between, at the annual Commission on the Status of Women meeting, member states report on the implementation of the Beijing documents. And that they do, there might be a questionnaire that is sent to member states, they respond to the questionnaire. UNIFEM previously, now UN Women would collate that, the Secretary General would come up with a report. So that happens on an annual basis in New York in February or March at the Commission on the Status of Women. But every 5 years, there's a review and appraisal process of the Beijing documents, which is undertaken by the Commission on the Status of Women. But the first review, a special session of the General Assembly was convened to review the implementation, and the theme was Women 2000, and we were looking at the 21st century. Some of the challenges that were identified here, again, it's the 12 critical areas that I mentioned. Violence and poverty was seen as major obstacles to achieving gender equality. The effects of globalization, feminization of poverty, acknowledgement that no major breakthrough regarding power and decision-making spheres. So if you think of women in the judiciary, women in the executive, women in the legislature, women on boards in the corporate sector, and you know, they weren't, the numbers were pretty low. And then we also had the emerging issues of HIV/AIDS, and some of our countries were impacted. South Africa, it was a pandemic here. You know, 800 people a day were dying. Trafficking became more and more visible. It was always happening, became more visible, and more attention was being paid to it. Harmful practices, armed conflict, and not, you know, it was internal armed conflict that we were seeing more and more. And the gender mainstreaming, which is the tool that was suggested in the Beijing documents, was not the norm in all spheres. And, you know, gender mainstreaming has had its fair share of criticism, including that it became everyone's responsibility and no one's job. So, you know, someone in government would be told, you have to make sure that all policies have a gender mainstreaming aspect. And that's it. And, you know, no one checked on it, etc. So it became this kind of technocratic tool, add women and stir approach. But it was found in 2000 that it wasn't the norm. And the countries that had rushed to set up national gender machineries, whether women's commissions, gender commissions, human rights commissions, these mechanisms were weak. They were underfunded because it was about the, you know, political, let's tick the box, we have it. So when we report, we can say we have it, but it wasn't serving the purpose which, you know, the goals were articulating. In 2005, the 10th anniversary of Beijing, again, this time the CSW did the review. and to identify the progress and obstacles. And there's the same methodology that's followed every 5 years. There are state reports, there's participation of states, there's interactive dialogues, high-level panels on different topics, expert group meetings, Secretary General's reports, and civil society holds side events in the Church Center, usually across the road from the UN in New York. This meeting, the high-level panels, tried to stress to member states that the Beijing is just not the standalone documents. There are synergies with Beijing and CEDAW, synergies with Beijing and the MDGs at that time. The importance of statistics and indicators, because we were moving into a world of show me the evidence. So show me the statistics, show me the indicators. Gender equality perspectives through the eyes of young women and men was part of the discussions, and macroeconomics became a part of this discussion about neoliberal economic policies, the impact that it was having particularly on the global south and developing countries, etc., World Bank structural adjustment programs, etc. And there was an acknowledgement that despite some achievements, the obstacles still were the same that were identified in the Beijing meeting in '95 and the 2000 review. Many, many countries had done legislative work. So lots of laws were passed, but there was this disconnect, this disjuncture. Lots of legislation, but not the willingness and the ability to implement the legislation. So of course, and then you had deficiencies in legislation, you had limited resources, lack of institutional coordination, and the persistence of harmful and discriminatory attitudes. Beijing +15 in 2010, the usual assessment, review and assessment, identification of challenges. This was 2008, 2009 with the global financial crisis. And so there was a huge focus on that. Interestingly, in this meeting, this meeting did not come up with an extensive summary or a definite outcome document, just a very minimalist declaration to mark the 15th anniversary, no overarching report on progress, etc. And again, this cynical part of me says, well, you know, there's a financial crisis. We don't want to have too much of discussion and give women more rights or put more burdens on countries by saying, you know, you're falling short, et cetera, et cetera. So there were huge political contestations about the language in the Beijing documents. There were these alliances with the Vatican and the Islamic states and Christian groups coming together to kind of reopen the language that was accepted in the Beijing document, to kind of start, you know, the clawbacks, etc. And so CSW decided, okay, there's no document coming out of this meeting. So this was a meeting, and it kind of begs the question, if there is a financial crisis, a medical epidemic crisis, do women's rights and obligations of states to the empowerment of women, to the realization of women's rights get pushed back? And I think, you know, history will judge us after COVID of what has happened and what we're going to lose. In 2015, again, the review and the recognition that there's growing inequality, and by now the MDGs were concluding, and so you had all this information on how bad inequality was across the globe. And so Beijing 20, you know, and the end of the MDGs, recognition of slow and uneven progress, gaps and obstacles, structural barriers in all 12 critical areas. No country has achieved full equality and empowerment of women and girls, not even the Nordic countries that make that claim. Significant inequality persists in multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, which those of you studying with Professor Nada know. And the recognition of vulnerability and marginalization throughout the life cycle of women. The Secretary General's report noted the world has not improved much for women and girls. Implementation has been slow and uneven. serious stagnation and even regression in several areas. And this is 5 years ago, in 2015. And of course, his report recognizes violence against women and girls as an unacceptably high rate. In 2015, there were the discussions at that time where we need a new sustainable development goals. And so the words comprehensive, transformative, etc., come into gender equality, women's empowerment. 2020, there were discussions last year, should we have a fifth World Conference on Women? But there wasn't much of an appetite and there was no consensus. There are groups that were demanding this because they felt there was so much of clawbacks on agreed language in intergovernmental meetings, unholy alliances. Sexual and reproductive rights were under attack all the time, backsliding, backlash, hostility regarding implementation, shrinking civic spaces. Also, we see this at our national, regional, international level. But the fear was that if we had a meeting in 2020, it would be really messy and ugly because the intergovernmental meeting and the spaces and those discussions might actually lead to more weakening of what was gained in Beijing. So the UN Women and I suppose others in the UN came up with a solution, which was let's have a hybrid meeting. They called it the Gender Equality Forum, hosted by Mexico and France in 2020. So 2 meetings in these 2 spaces, not in New York. And UN Women did host an expert group meeting in September last year to identify what were the different trends that were coming out, what were the issues of concern that would feed into the Mexico and France meeting. But CSW did not happen in the 2-week session this year because of COVID. So they had a 1-day event in March and some opening statements and 2 civil society statements. And we didn't have the usual parallel sessions, debates, dialogues, etc. But they did adopt a political declaration. The reports that have come up, the Secretary General's report in particular, the goals remain aspirational, implementation is ad hoc at best, continuing and increasing fundamental gaps, commitments are not matched by action, investment, or accountability, and there's a continuation of addressing the symptoms rather than the causes. And, we have a perpetual state of crisis when it comes to women's human rights and the empowerment of women. And the lack of progress is a wake-up call. Now, this is 25 years down the line. Gender Equality Forum, of course, didn't get hosted in Mexico or France because of COVID. But what the preparations did was they took the 12 critical areas of Beijing and then the Sustainable Development Goals, and they came up with the 6 overarching thematic action coalitions. So the 6 themes that they've come up with now are inclusive development, shared prosperity, decent work, poverty eradication, social services. And when you look at these 6, they kind of feed more into the SDGs and in a sense, I think, dilute the kind of richness that we saw in the Beijing documents. But again, politically palatable. What is it that member states will say okay to? And my concern about this is this new model, does it address the challenges and gaps, the power, knowledge, resources, political will, state responsibility? How do you address backlash? How do you address the closing of civic spaces for discussions and debates, etc.? I did have some other critiques. How involved has the feminist movement been involved in kind of bringing the 12 critical areas, the SDGs, into these 6 themes? Has the feminist movement been involved? How do we do movement building under these kind of circumstances, And I know we can hark back to this amazing 1995 meeting, but every year the CSW, even if it's 5,000, people from around the world coming, there's a richness to that. There's a solidarity, there's an inclusiveness. There are these amazing partnerships and discussions. And I'm not sure that this kind of model will allow for movement building. So some of my observations, and I'm really sorry, but I have 2 more slides to go. So states have recognized women's rights to equality. They may disagree with the content. They may use religion and culture and custom and tradition to how far they would go. So some countries have equality in the constitution, but they also have a clause in the constitution that says when it comes to issues of family law provisions would trump equality. So in a way, legislated discrimination is allowed, and Zambia had that, you know, in their constitution, which they've now amended. But there are countries that have that. Saudi Arabia doesn't have a constitution, all right? So how do we take the numerous interpretations of the Sharia that, you know, we know exist and ask, okay, so what are we talking about in terms of equality? The domestication of standards that have emanated out of the international and the regional system, we see that in laws and policies at our national level. 95, as I mentioned, the 1995 meeting created this rich space for advocating for rights, empowerment, transnational engagement, movement building, etc. Intersectionality, transformative language of rights and justice to address emancipation and liberation of women. In 2020, what do we see? We see the backlash, we see the backsliding, we see regression. We see this movement in the UN. At the Human Rights Council, Russia tables a resolution on traditional values. And immediately the red flags come up. What are traditional values? Are traditional values there to oppress women? We all have traditions. You know, my tradition is a simple one of my children and grandchildren come for lunch on a Sunday. That's my tradition, you know, but what are we talking about in traditional values? But, you know, there was a lot of support by Islamic countries, by the Vatican, Christian movements, etc. The arguments around gender ideologies, we're seeing this in Hungary, we're seeing this in Poland as well. This is a discussion that is coming up, these arguments about this is anything that you talk about women's human rights, this is gender ideology. And ideologies are by the very nature bad, according to these people. Instead of ideologies are a common shared understanding of values, of principles, etc. So gender ideologies in a very negative sense is something we're seeing. Austerity measures and the impact on social spending, we're seeing that. We saw that coming out of the financial crash of 2008, 2009, but we're also seeing it. And I saw this in the UK. Austerity measures get impacted, social spending gets cut. Women and children are highly reliant on social spending, on social services, education, health, clean water, etc. Attacks on multilateralism. We've seen the US walk out of the UN, the Human Rights Council, and we see the World Health Organization during this time of COVID come under attack by some countries, including the US. The rise of authoritarian governments in many parts of the world, the rise of fundamental movements and neoliberal economic policies that put a noose around the neck of countries, sexual and reproductive rights under attack. I think it's Poland most recently, the Constitutional Court judgment on abortion rights. So we're seeing this in different countries of the world. And, you know, one of my observations is, has the past 25 years neutralized radical feminist resistance? Is the development approach to women's human rights part of the problem? Has it led to a focus on, it's about those people in the global south, it's about poor women, it's about Black women, it's about brown women. So the othering of, so, you know, when you think about FGM, you think about trafficking, you think about early and forced marriages. Oh no, it's those people, but they're bad problems in the global south. Has this development approach led to that? Has Beijing become the ceiling? That's it, that's what we're going to accept. The limit of what governments will agree to. So we said, okay, that's it, we're going to close the door. What about pushing the boundaries? And, you know, I mean, I tried to push the boundaries during my 6-year term to close the normative gap on violence against women, to have a specific treaty on violence against women, and the pushback from CEDAW, from UN agencies, etc., because it's about let's protect the space. So we've all become, not we all, I'm going to remove myself. There's this culture of the politics of fear. Let's not go down this road, because if we do, we're going to lose something, right? Now, Beijing is a policy document. It's not a legally binding instrument. It's not a treaty. So if it gets chipped away, it's not that they're chipping away at CEDAW, right? If they were chipping away at all the 9 treaties that we have, that's a different story. But this politics of fear has led to people becoming more defensive of trying to protect Beijing and these and you know the subsequent policy documents. And I think we've kind of neutralized the radical feminist resistance to push back at the UN and other forums. Inequality and discrimination persists in all spheres in all our countries. In the home, unpaid care work, and COVID has exacerbated that. Violence against women in public and private spaces, stereotypical gendered roles. I saw an article recently, 1,200 women have disappeared between March and June in Peru. Brazil, 143 women were murdered in 2 months. The inequality and discrimination in the place of work, the lack of pay parity, lack of job opportunities, promotion, sexual harassment. The World Bank says that at the current rate, it'll take 150 years to achieve gender parity in lifetime earned income. I will never have enough, the same amount of money as a man for 150 years because of my earning potential, the fact that I may not have a decent retirement package because I may have taken time off to have children or health issues, etc. A recent UK study also said women in their 30s will never know equal pay in their working lives if progress is not accelerated. Imagine that you're in your 30s, you've just finished, probably have a PhD, get your first job. You don't earn the same. You're never going to earn the same unless something drastic happens. At a social level, society, cultural and religious norms that entrench inequality and discrimination, stereotyping, gendered roles, violence, denial of opportunities to contribute to society. In many of our countries, women are more than half the world's population. They're more than half the world's population, but they're also more than half the population in their countries. At an institutional level, access to justice challenges, and it's not just about women who go seeking protection orders in courts. It's about how they're treated throughout the justice system, whether they go for a divorce or for any other matter. Persisting public-private dichotomy and stereotype biases and prejudices. At a structural level, feminization of poverty and all these factors above, highlight and reinforce the feminization of poverty, status and roles of women, power and control issues, and societal norms which impact on public and private life. I thought it's important because many of you are based in the US. How do we bring women's rights home back to the US? Is it important to specifically include women's equality provisions in a constitution? Will it make a difference in your constitution? I taught at Boston University in the law school last year. And it's interesting, the debates around, I taught 2 human rights courses, but the debates around human rights in the US. Does it make a difference? It has made a difference because a normative framework allows for standard setting, allows for accountability to hold someone responsible when this right is not realized. It allows for the interrogation of laws and policies and practices. It allows for judicial review if equality and non-discrimination provisions are not met. You had the Equal Rights Amendment Act. It never got ratified in the US. I was watching Mrs. America recently on TV, and I could see the conservative activism against it. The misrepresentation that it would, if we had the ERA, it would support abortion, homosexuality, erode the traditional role of women as wives, as mothers, as daughters, etc., would impact family life. Are these arguments still relevant today? I also, in my teaching, used the US women's soccer team suing for equal pay, equal treatment, openly claiming their sexuality, standing up for LGBT rights. And, you know, this happened last year in 2019. So it means the demands for equality and non-discrimination continue centuries later. The hashtag #MeToo movement, the T presidency brought attention back to the ERA. Will it get adopted under the Biden administration to entrench sex equality? I don't know. That's over to you. Will the US ratify? I think it was, which of your presidents signed CEDAW? Carter. President Carter signed CEDAW, but has never been ratified, not even under progressive administrations like under Clinton or Obama. So CEDAW has never been ratified. Of course, we didn't expect the Bush administration to ratify CEDAW. Will you become part of the international community, you know, and be part of the international standard setting? Because it's not good enough for the US with its exceptionalism to say our constitution is fine, we don't need these provisions, and we can teach the rest of the world. I think this year and this period on the election period challenges, it's actually made the world community ask some hard questions about exceptionalism and can you actually dictate to the rest of the world when you're one of the few countries that has not ratified CEDAW or the Children's Rights Convention for that matter. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that it's taken this long, but it's a long journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stop the share.
Thank you very much, Rashida, for this really informative and insightful historical overview, as well as reflections on the achievements and challenges, as well as gaps in the quest for the realization of women's human rights globally and in the United States. I found the questions you asked towards the end of your talk extremely critical, really important to engage with. And I'm not going to sum up your talk or repeat your questions because there are a number of participants, including Hayat Imam and Judith Baker, who have posted questions. So I will hand it over to Elora Chowdhury to facilitate the Q&A at this point.
Nada.
Thank you, Nada, and thank you, Professor Manjoo, and thank you, Tashi, for your wonderfully expansive and historical presentations. And Nada, I'm happy to help you with the question and answers, but feel free to jump in anytime. I will just start with some of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A. And there are a couple of ones around the question of gender mainstreaming. There was also a question about that in the chat, I noticed. So just this question comes from Hayat Imam that the whole gender mainstreaming trend in a way has derailed the women's rights movement, and that what do you, if you have any thoughts about that?
Elora, do you want to do 3 questions and I can take them?
Sure. So there is a question around gender mainstreaming that has sort of, you know, in a way depoliticized the women's movements, particularly in the global South, and if you have thoughts about that. There is also a question around from Judith Baker. Could you give some examples of policy that addresses symptoms, not causes, of women's oppression? And what, in your opinion, are the causes of women's oppression? There's another question from Elizabeth Dussault, and this one asks about how do you feel the rights or recognition of gender non-binary people can relate to the challenges and activisms and of those for women? Should new articles or charters be developed to specifically outline their rights and work to address oppressions?
Thank you. Hayat, I agree with you completely. Gender mainstreaming has depoliticized the women's movement. It's become a technocratic tool. So it's you know, the add woman and stir. So make sure if you're employing that you have women. In your policy, you use the word woman. In your meetings, you include women. And it became a technical exercise to tick boxes in the UN as well as outside. And I think the UN has recognized that as a problem. In its purest form, I suppose, the goal would have been that gender mainstreaming is a tool that one would use to look at individual, institutional, structural, systemic challenges. And one would think about at each of those levels, how would you address it to achieve your empowerment and gender equality goals? Unfortunately, life doesn't work on all those levels. And it became a simple policy. If we were gonna, if violence against women, if the data was showing that violence against women was a huge problem in the country, should we have a law on this? Because then we can say we're addressing an issue that disproportionately impacts women. Whether the legislation actually addressed the causes, and it goes into a little bit of Judith's question, into the causes and the consequences of that, was not part of the discussion. It was about what do we get in law, what can we do? At a minimum, protection orders or criminalization, etc., as opposed to protection measures, prevention measures, addressing structural root causes that are part and parcel of the problem. So I agree that it's not a tool that worked out really well, including within the UN. Specificity provides a spotlight, which I'm a huge proponent. I believe in a dual twin track approach. So you have the generic and you have the specific. So and it goes to the third question actually of the recognition of gender non-binary persons and specificity. And that's a huge fight within the UN to get the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity on the radar. The pushback, I mean, you know, the pushback was that this is not a human rights issue simply because it's not addressed in the UDHR or any of the subsequent treaties. But the High Commissioner's Office, special procedures mandate holders, treaty bodies, kept on referring to, and in every country that I went, I would look at the issue of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender persons, etc., and look at it through a discrimination and equality lens and a state responsibility lens. So the best that we got out of the UN was in the Human Rights Council, where you have a resolution on sexual and orientation, gender identity, and violence that is experienced by those communities. Is there appetite for specificity in terms of a treaty? I doubt it, not at this stage. But it comes up in resolutions, and resolutions are non-binding policy articulations. And in theory, you know, many states agree that this is an equality, non-discrimination issue. But I don't think they would go. If they couldn't, you know, support my motion to have a violence against women and girls treaty within the UN system because of the gap in CEDAW, I'm not sure that this level of specificity will be addressed. That's at the level of international law. In terms of the movements and solidarity, I have seen debates going on about including transgender women. Are they really women? The issues around gender neutral bathrooms, etc. And I think some of the debates and discussions have been really ugly and exclusionary. Instead of asking, how does equality, non-discrimination, and state responsibility tie in with this? What should the movements outside of the UN be doing? How do they come together to be more inclusive of gender non-binary persons? What is it, can we strategically think about? Give me a minute, I need to charge my computer. What can we think about in terms of okay, that's done. Thank you. What can we think about in terms of creatively thinking about, so we have 9 treaties, right? What are the issues, what are the experiences of gender non-binary, of the community? What are the experiences of discrimination, of violence, etc., of non-inclusion? What are the implications of that? And how can we creatively think of approaching the other treaty bodies if CEDAW won't address it? How do we go to the Human Rights Commission on the Civil and Political Rights Convention? How do we go to the Torture Convention, the Torture Committee, and use examples of torture? And, I've seen this in prisons that I've visited, where you have transgender persons being put into the male prisons, being sodomized on numerous occasions. People who've started the process of surgery needing medication while they're in prisons and being denied that to fully transition. And it's not just the violence, the bodily integrity violations, just that lack of dignity and respect that is so prevalent in so many institutions and all over the world. So I do think that at this point in time, a specific treaty is not going to fly. Should we have it? I think so. I think specificity allows us to look at the numerous manifestations that those of us that are not in that situation would not know. You cannot, anticipate all the issues to fall into equality and non-discrimination. And that's my challenge with CEDAW. CEDAW says violence against women is discrimination. I'm sorry, it doesn't always. Violence against women is a cause discrimination is a cause and a consequence of violence. But until we are specific about it, we're not going to be able to deal with it. Judith speaks about the symptoms and not the causes. And I think that's, and I use the violence as part of the oppression, subordination, etc. And I think, the examples for me, Judith, would be liberation and emancipation of women and girls. Where do we start? Education is a starting point, but education, not only formal education, but education in our homes, in our communities, in our societies. Education by our political leaders, because what we see on television reflects back in our homes, in our communities, etc. So the causes of oppression, the causes of subordination are underpinned by, inequalities, by discrimination. But we address the symptoms. Okay, parity in education. But what's the quality of the education? What are the textbooks that children are studying? Where's the, is someone examining the racism, the sexism that's inherent in so many of the practices in the literature that our children are subjected to in schools? The opportunities. There's a huge campaign about sanitary pads and providing that so that girls can attend schools. yes, we will, and my students at the University of Cape Town were collecting sanitary pads to go and distribute at a township school. And I asked a question. I said, okay, they need sanitary pads. Do they have appropriate, safe toilet facilities to be able to go and change their pads while they're at school? And they said, we don't know. I said, have you asked the question? Because if there's no door on a toilet, girls are not going to go into those toilets. So those are the structural, aspects that we don't talk about. We want to talk about parity in education, get more girls into primary school and high school. What about the violence? That's, one of the structural problems. We talk about teenage pregnancies. We talk about dropouts in high school. But we don't talk about the power and control issues, the abuse of power and authority in schools, where girls are raped, are subjected to sexual harassment, who don't want to go to school. These are the structural, these are causes of, inequality, discrimination, oppression, etc. So I hope I've answered Judith's question on that, but I'm dying to get back to travel and get back to Boston to have more of these conversations.
Yes, we would welcome that when we get to the other side of this pandemic.
Absolutely. Now that I'm kicked out at 65 from my university.
Well, certainly we look forward to that visit. We have a question from Abdullah Al-Mohammed, and this is about one of the challenges that some face, speaking about. So Abdullah Al-Mohammed is speaking from the context of the Gulf countries. One of the major challenges is the national identity when speaking and trying to tackle discrimination against women in regards giving their children the citizenship, while keeping in mind most countries in the Gulf have signed and ratified CEDAW. How can this thought be fought?
Do you have any other questions, Laura?
There is another question from Kelly in the chat box. Your report on violence, Keely, sorry, your report on violence against women in El Salvador has permitted women to gain political asylum for women escaping abusive relationships. Can you talk about your experiences in El Salvador and in other countries? And for Tashi, what advice would you give to current human rights minor students?
Okay. Thank you. The Gulf countries and passing on of nationality. This is one of the challenges of signing, ratifying, acceding to international treaties, and then not meeting obligations that emanate from those treaties. That's on the part of the state, not meeting those obligations. But those states report to a monitoring body, whether it's the Human Rights Committee, whether it's to CEDAW, etc. And when they report to those countries, to those monitoring bodies, all you get out of that system is concluding observations. So you are asked the questions, your nationality law discriminates against women in terms of passing on nationality to their children or their foreign spouses. And a concluding observation would be review and amend your laws relating to nationality. And that's about it. Now, in an ideal world, and my dream for 30 or 40 years has been, if we had an international human rights court, a court of human rights internationally, because a treaty monitoring body does not have enforcement powers. It's not a court of law. These are not judges, right? So all they can do is make observations and make recommendations. And they can follow up and ask the same questions, but they cannot enforce any of their recommendations. If we had a court, so if we take the African system, we have a commission, African Commission on People's and Human Rights, on Human and People's Rights, and we have a court on human rights, which has different chambers. If the commission is not satisfied when a state reports, and we see this in the inter-American system, we see this in the European system, then the Commission can refer the matter to the court. The court can come up with a legally binding judgment and findings. And then it's, you know, it goes beyond naming and shaming. So in one sense, what the treaty body's monitoring does, it's naming and shaming. But what a court does is imposes and reinforces the obligations that you have. So unfortunately, in the international system, we don't have an international court on human rights. So the Gulf countries and other countries get away with discriminatory laws using their culture, the religion, the tradition, despite having obligations in terms of that. Then when you have people like the person who asked this question raising and doing activism and advocacy, then freedom of association, freedom of expression gets implicated, and the human rights defenders then are either incarcerated, tortured, and we've seen this in so many, we've seen reprisals in different countries. I would encourage that this issue of the nationality and the passing of nationality by women to their children or their foreign spouses, it should not be left to sending a complaint to CEDAW only. Because when you think about it, it implicates civil and political rights, right? It violates your right to be an effective citizen because men are not implicated by this nationality law. So I would send a complaint to the Human Rights Committee that monitors the ICCPR, right? The Civil and Political Rights Covenant also, to highlight, and not just to CEDAW, because I think when we send these complaints just to CEDAW, we also ghettoize women's issues into this one treaty body, whereas we can use the Torture Committee, we can use the Human Rights Committee, the Economic, Social, Cultural Rights Committee, etc. And now, of course, disabilities, migrant workers, etc. El Salvador had a new president, I think, when I went. It was a really good report, and I'm very glad that, you know, highlighting the pervasive, widespread levels of violence against women in El Salvador, in Mexico, in other countries in the Latin American region, has led to other countries recognizing that when women from those countries flee the violence, not only in the home, in the communities as well. So, you know, the drug-related networks, etc., that I saw in, I'm trying to think, I think it was in El Salvador and somewhere else. So I'm glad that whether it's European countries or the US, although I know the US has under Jeff Sessions, there was some document which was adopted, which actually now precludes admitting people who come in based on violence, you know, domestic violence or gang-related violence to get asylum. So I'm glad there are countries that are still accepting people from El Salvador. Tashi, in terms of the countries that I've covered, you know, because of where I come from, I made sure that I didn't use a spotlight only on the global South. So I looked at global North, global South countries, and I think, you know, taking on visiting the US, the UK, Italy, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then going to the Pacific Islands, which not many mandate holders at that time had gone to, so Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, India, Bangladesh, and I went to Bangladesh after that terrible Rana, the factory that had burnt down and the people died in that. In Africa, I've done Sudan, Nada's country, Zambia, Algeria. And so there's been this cross-section of countries that I have visited. And in each one, there is something that I learned that I can then share with the other countries that I go to. And, you know, the US report is still relevant. People still use it. Many other countries, you know, Algeria, after one of my recommendations to Algeria was Algeria didn't have a specific law on violence against women or domestic violence. They had the penal code, which is a general criminal code. And my recommendation to Algeria was to adopt to have specificity in legislation. When you have a widespread and pervasive problem, specificity becomes crucial. And Algeria, the ambassador met with me, which was really nice after the mission. We had lunch together, went through my recommendations so I could explain why I was recommending certain things. And Algeria adopted a legislation on violence against women. Jordan as well has a law on violence against women. And I think, you know, in the Middle East, in the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa region, when you have like one country, so if you take Morocco and their progressive family laws that came up, it has a spin-off effect. Other countries start following. In not because you know, it could be competitive, it could be that we can do this, but it does have a spin-off effect. So you know, that's been good to see. The US, I'd made recommendations because I looked at sexual violence in the military. I looked at the disproportionate incarceration of African American women and the violence that they faced in custodial settings. I looked at immigration detention, you know, so I physically go and I interview people and I look at the circumstances, and I raised issues around the immigration detention centers. And there has been, I mean, one of the things for women in prisons in the US during my visit was to hear from women about being incarcerated without their children, coming from the East Coast, being incarcerated on the West Coast. If they didn't have contact with their children, contact, either physical contact, telephonic contact, after 15 months, their parental rights were terminated. There was a law that their parental rights were terminated if they did not have contact with their children for 15 months. And I raised this as an issue. If someone's family is on the East Coast, they don't have the resources to come and visit. Telephone calls in prisons are expensive because it's all privatized. So if you're paying $10 for a 3-minute call, how many times can you call your family? Do you even have $10 when you're in prison? If you're an African-American woman, if you're a Latino woman, you are in prison are not given equal opportunities to earn money. You're not getting those good jobs where you can earn money so you can buy those little treats that you need, make telephone calls to your family, save some money for other stuff. No, you're not. You're not getting those jobs. And, you know, this is part of what I did for 6 years, is going to immigration detention, going to prisons, going to psychiatric hospitals to see the conditions under which women were kept. I used to go to, in countries where there was, I'm trying to think what is the word, in Bangladesh, displaced, like the Rohingyas, the camps, right? In Bangladesh, they refused to let me go and talk to the women in the Rohingya women in the camps, because they said it isn't, the government's argument was that I was the mandate holder on violence against women, not on women living in sort of these camps, etc. But, you know, they were on Bangladeshi soil, which meant that as a mandate holder, I should have had access to every woman. But I've been to these places, talk to women. So one of the things we do before we start a country visit is we try and identify individuals, organizations, etc. in these countries, tell them about the visit, provide some sort of background of what I'm going to look at, set up interviews, ask them to bring people together, ask people to send written submissions. So when I hit the ground running, I know what the legislative landscape is. I know what the international law obligations are. I know what the problems are because I've already started receiving information. And then when you get into a country, you can start those meetings. I would say I would spend about 40% of my time in a country talking to government officials, visiting government entities and things. And then about 60% with civil society organizations, individuals, and capturing their stories. And then you, at the end of a visit, and a visit could be, I think my US visit was about 3 weeks because I went from coast to coast. It can be anything from 10 days to 3 weeks. There are financial constraints in the UN, so you can't make it longer than that. At the end of it, you hold a press interview, you hold a press conference. You have met with the government in that morning. You've shared a draft of the press release that you're going to hand out. And then you hold your press conference, and sometimes you leave the country as quickly as possible. There are reprisals. There have been concerns in some countries about my safety. You leave the country and then you write a report, which you present to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And I would, of course, provide a synopsis to the General Assembly when I reported to them in New York every October. So that's, in a way, for the students, it kind of tells you what the process is and the work that's involved. My advice for students who are doing the human rights, the minor in human rights, is congratulations. You have made a really good decision. The human rights is not just about law. Human rights is about respect. It's about dignity. It's about equality. It's about non-discrimination. It's about voice. It's about agency. And I think you learn so much from the anecdotal as well as the research on people's lives and people's realities, that you yourself get changed in that process, even if you never work for a civil society organization or a government or practice. For those of you that have the luxury of doing a master's degree, I would encourage you, if your university or other universities offer a master's, we offer a master's in human rights, and I convene the human rights program. And we get a lot of foreign students coming here to do the human rights program with us, because apparently it's not a common thing globally at universities. But I would encourage you to do a master's in human rights, because it does shape your thinking conceptually. It makes you understand how the political systems work. It kind of, you get a sense of the nuance of the hypocrisy when you're watching the news and what's behind it in the different countries that we all live in, and what we hear and what we see and what's behind it. For students in the US, I think the last 4 years have been horrific in terms of any kind of sustainability and holding on to human rights because of the administration. And my hope is that the new administration, comes back into the UN structures. And it's not just about the US, we pay the most amount, the dues, etc. It's about that message that you also send out, not because you're the best in the world, but it's about solidarity. It's about understanding that in many ways we're all in the same boat. And, COVID and post-COVID, we all are in the same boat. And I think the Secretary General said, some people are in leaking vessels on the Mediterranean Sea, and other people are in their super yachts. That's the difference when we look at the inequalities. So I would encourage you, if your interest continues, to do that. The one starting point when I, start my teaching with my students is to always remember the UN is a government of governments. The UN is not this independent entity out there. It's a government of governments. Governments act in their own best interest. And so it's always going to be a challenge, and you're going to constantly be knocking at that door. You're going to be disruptive. You're going to be asking the harder questions. The second thing is human rights is not about looking at the world at what you want it to be. It's about looking at the world at what it is and the potential for what it could be. But your starting point as a human rights activist is what is. and you walk into spaces, you look at research reports, and you ask yourself what is, so that you get a sense of the humanity behind it. The human beings, these are not just words or faceless individuals. And I think, Tashi, you're reminding us about Tibet, highlights that these are human beings. There are people here. This is not about numbers. This is not about words, So what is, and where do we want to go with it? And we are not the people that are going to change the world. It's the people on the ground who are already crying for change, who want change. And we play a very small role in providing the tools because we may be a little bit more privileged in our knowledge base, etc. So I think I've answered all. 2 minutes to go.
Right, we are almost at the end, and I just wanted to turn to you, Tashi, and see if you have any closing comments. I just wanted to tell you that I was very inspired by what you said, and particularly when you talked about self-care and self-preservation, particularly in the context of the cultural and religious genocide that you talked about. And in fact, I taught my last classes of the semester today, and we were discussing the work of Audre Lorde in the context of the US and also the current movements that are going on around racial injustice in this country. So the Black Lives Matter movement, and similarly these ideas that you bring up about human rights as the personal is political and the self-preservation and self-care being self-preservation at the face of such hostilities really spoke to me. So, if you have any last words.
Yeah, thank you for those kind words. I'm glad, you were inspired by it. I was pretty nervous throughout, so I'm glad, some good came out of it. I would say, everything Rashida said about the human rights minor and the human rights, going to get a master's, just the discipline in general really helps students think outside of the box, helps students think about the larger structures in life. I had a social psychology major, so I was able to sort of do that in both of my major and minor. But I think, if somebody adopted the minor, it would really complement many of the majors available. But my advice is also just for students in general. It's a really tough time for all of us. I've experienced it as well. And I would say my advice would be to find something to really sustain your motivation through the ups and downs of your education. And there's going to be a lot of them. And I think, the current pandemic really shows that you really need to find something to stay motivated while you're doing your education. So yeah, for me, it's been, being the first in my family to get a master's degree and a larger desire to work in the social, human services sphere somehow. Not that everybody has to have, a motivation like that, but just to find something, anything is really important. I also say that I fortunately had people in my time at UMass Boston to really push me to think bigger for myself. I have a really self-critical nature about myself, and I always thought that I couldn't do stuff because of my background or my whatever, right? But I always had people just to tell me, continue doing it and just put the application in. There's no harm in doing it, and I'm really glad I did, because I don't know if I would have even applied to graduate school if people didn't push me and reassured me. So I would also just want to be one person to tell some students to dream bigger and just put the applications in. And if you want to reach out to me, I can help you with your papers if you want for grad school and your application process. So I can put my email down here if anybody wants to reach out. But thank you for inviting me to speak.
It's our pleasure. And Professor Manjoo, I really hope that you will come back to us, because I had so many questions which I didn't get to ask you, and would really love to continue this conversation. But thank you for your generous sharing of time and knowledge, and inspiring all of us about human rights and the long trajectory of work that you have done in this field. It's been a real honor to host you today. And very warm thank you to our audience. Many are still here, and really appreciate you all being here and participating and engaging. Tremendous thanks to Professor Ali for organizing this event and doing the hard work of teaching and inspiring your students daily. And of course, thank you, Brittany, for making this happen so smoothly, and always for your enthusiasm. So with that, shall we say?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
I just want to add one word, really, to thank everybody and to thank Professor Manjoo. I want to ask you whether you have scholarships in your program, in case students from UMass Boston wanted to apply for them.
No, I think we're all in the same boat in terms of trying to get students who can pay to come.
And just to let everybody know that Professor Manjoo has donated her honorarium, toward the support of the Educational Success Mentor Program. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nada. Inshallah, see you next year.
Inshallah.
Hopefully in person.